ready to go. I think Sally has some questions.
First one to Rob, actually. I was really interested to look at the way that companies had been agile and had coped with the uncertainty due to COVID-19. And working for a university, you know, we've been hugely impacted by the loss of students from internationally. Are there any sort of, so what would be an example of an adaptive, or so have there been universities that have managed to turn this to their advantage?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think the example your Chancellor talked through about how quickly you moved to put courses online. I think everybody's scrambling.
Yes.
To do that. I'm probably a bit surprised that how a number of the US universities are not expecting, you know, a return to classes, you know, for
no, they're not. No, for September.
The next year.
Yeah.
So whereas I know there were at least some hopes that there may be opportunities for Australia, you know, to attract students that wouldn't otherwise be going to places like the US next year.
Yeah, I suppose it's also, I would have expected, you know, so we've all gone online, but not seemed to capitalised on that going online as universities, whereas there's other educational institutions, of which you spoke about, one of them, who have actually capitalised on that sort of online learning and gone up through the roof, Yeah,
and I think that's what surprised me is in this particular company that, you know, they've just had students from all around the world taking advantage of a 6-week free offer. And of course, then the challenge is to convert them after that period of time. But I mean, what happened in that particular case, they may have invested literally millions to put people into the US, UK, Asia to gain the knowledge that they've got, you know, with a free offer for a 6-week trial.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Alrighty, so one to Ian, the personal information factor. I like the fact that you did the sensitivity versus the personal information. And I've got the obvious question, which is, that's how much uncertainty is that around, you know, those sensitivities versus the personal information?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first proposed it, people said it is not quantifiable, don't try. So that's a great challenge to get started with. So if we take the sensitivity aspects, the sort of the way that the standard world thinks is that you don't tell people that it is or is not sensitive. You say, if it is sensitive, and if we can quantify that sensitivity, this is how you'd use it. This is how you build the risk framework around it. So subjects, things like data subject is sensitive information. The question is how sensitive. That is subjective. And you could run through that subjectivity question based on thresholds, and you might use numeric thresholds, or you might use descriptive thresholds and then convert them to numeric. So children at risk of harm, minorities, information about religious beliefs and so on. And the point then is that that can be a subjective argument, and then you could start to do effectively calculus with that subjectivity. If you had sensitivity 3 in this domain and sensitivity 4 in some other domain, and you had aspects of data quality which might align or mismatch with your algorithmic needs, then you might also have a different level of sensitivity. And so you could start to see how you would drive that forward. But in terms of quantification, it's an absolute doozy. But the attempt
That's a great word too.
The attempt to try and identify where the subjectivity or uncertainty is, and then work with it, is the current objective.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a very interesting piece of work. And so when you had it up on the board, you know, is there something that sort of screamed out at you that we should be doing for around COVID-19 that we weren't doing? Some information or some piece, you know, so I'm trying to think of it sort of a little bit like, it's totally different from what Roman talked about, but it's trying to get at the same thing, which is what's the value, the information content of a piece of data. Only you came at it from a different point of view.
Yeah, Roman, I was really impressed by what Roman did. And I'd love to be able to do that in this case. So the argument of real data is really about transparency and building and maintaining trust with government. We have been using lots of data during the COVID period, lots of non-traditional data sets, and it was public information that we used telco data to try and understand mobility, and whether or not there was social distancing or whether or not people were staying home. They were relatively crude measures at SA2 level, but they were the first time that sort of information has ever been used for a pandemic, at least in New South Wales. We also work with the banks and we work with other non-traditional data suppliers using data products. The question ultimately is, what can we release to tell people what's happening in their community? And there's very, very strong public interest in understanding, in particular, the difference between no cases and one case. And of course, the numbers that increase after that point. And that question of how, worst case scenario, if you knew someone was in a data set, or if you knew they were in that postcode, what information would you gain if you knew they were the only person in that postcode? And that was the common sense argument we applied about whether or not we were starting to move down the pathway of reasonably likely to re-identify someone. But if you knew someone was already in a data set, what would you gain? So those are quite a few conversations with the Privacy Commissioner and with some folks in the Data Analytics and Advisory Board with legal backgrounds, thinking through that question of worst case, if you knew someone was there, what are we releasing? If you didn't know someone was in the data set, but you're interested in a certain postcode or a certain date, what would you gain? So again, quantification of that, the only quantification we've got is this information factor. And again, it's at best a relative measure, but it does speak to the information gain if you assumed that every possibility was equally likely and then learnt exactly what the number was. So at least that part is quantifiable.
Okay, thank you. So Fang, I was really interested in yours. You had a similar thing. You didn't call it the personal information factor, but basically the usefulness versus the quality of the data. How does that sort of map on to Ian's framework?
I think it's just, probably a different angle to address that, but I think that framework will work fine. We just change a bit of labeling into that. I think Ian was talking more towards the sensitivity of the data. So
rather than the usefulness,
yeah. So we sorry, this is too obvious overlap. However, what I was mentioning or addressing is that comparing to the business outcome. So from the business outcome perspective, whether the data provide supports to achieve that outcome. So it's like a feasibility, some kind of angle on that one.
Okay, thanks, Fang.
So Rob has a question for Roman.
Roman, I was having a conversation last night with a fire chief who'd been involved with one of the mega fires over the summer, and asked him about the value of having a drone map the fire, and particularly with the kind of approaches that you've set out. And interestingly enough, he said, "Oh, look, it'd be fantastic." And I had a situation where I wasn't prepared to take my truck up the hill because I wasn't sure what was there, and and it was quite hazardous, and we really lacked that. He said, "But problem is not whether the drone will provide the information, but the service, the RFS, was concerned about potentially running into helicopters, that were in the area." Now that's a totally different issue than the one that you've framed, but it just seems to me partly to sort of be able to solve and then sell your solution. You have to come up with some metric that sort of says, well, you're better off with this type of approach than having a helicopter in the area. But I'm interested whether that issue's come up with you before.
Thanks for the question, Robert. Luckily, that was not about the solution of the complex integral that I put on the slides. So I guess there's multiple challenges when you think about using drones for bushfires, not just collisions with helicopters, but between drones, if you have multiple of them, how do you coordinate them efficiently, and also how you avoid them of getting melted basically due to the high heat if you get too close to the fire as well. So I guess there's multiple challenges from a robotics perspective. Today, I guess I was pretty much giving an overview of how the drones would make their decisions, which is only part of the problem. Then you would have to embed multiple sort of like subsystems within each drone, which is onboard processing, battery power, or how would they have enough energy? How will they come back to base? How will they localize, through GPS or whatever? There's so many other problems that need to be tackled by a multidisciplinary team.
Thanks very much, Roman. Now we have a question for Ian from one of the attendees. Can your algorithmic approach be extended to GIPA or freedom of information requests?
That's a great question. Just bear in mind, I described it as a Model T Ford at the moment, and we're very proud that we've got a gearbox and our speedometer. So it also, so far, has only been applied to row and column type data. Now, we have been trying to recomplicate the number of data sets we can apply it to. And we've also worked now with justice and transport, looking at a range of other data sets. And we've also tackled the next really big challenge, which is longitudinal data sets, which everyone must recall the NBS PBS data set 10% that was released by the Commonwealth Government a few years ago. It's very easy to re-identify, or at least identify unique trajectories or unique pathways in those data sets. So we're tackling those problems at the moment. So trying to take into account, make the algorithm more sensitive, take into consideration better a priori information, look at trajectories. And if a GIPA request looked at that sort of data, then there's no reason why we couldn't at least run the test. What we have been doing is using existing open data and trying to understand the level of comfort that people have using what's called the abdominal computer and all the equations that run in the abdominal computer versus what we measure from the personal information according to sensitivity is helping us calibrate what we could release. So in principle, there's no reason why not. But at this stage, it doesn't carry the weight of law, it doesn't carry the weight of any regulatory consideration. It's something which is in the process of being calibrated.
Thank you. We have another question for Roman. This one's a quick one. Can you please give more information about the book you mentioned for Bayesian optimization? Someone, I think, wants to do a bit more research.
Sure. I guess I'll post the reference on the chat if that is enough. But it's just been released this year, and it's basically the first book that fully talks about Bayesian optimization, going into very sort of like good details about, you know, what a family of acquisition functions are there out there, what other surrogate models apart from Gaussian processes can you use, and also how you deal with sequential decision making. So I'm very glad that they've actually cited one of my papers in the book.
Well done, Roman.
Excellent.
Could I ask Roman the question then? So Roman, listening to Fang and Ian and talking about sort of metrics that they're using, maybe sort of acquisition functions, which at the moment you're looking at the mean and the variance sort of trade-off in your acquisition. Basically, you're building your acquisition function from those types of measures, but maybe there could be an acquisition function that, for example, tried to maximize or minimize personal information. I'm just trying to think which way around it would be, but that takes those two dimensions that Fang's talked about, which is one set of dimensions. Another set of dimensions could be Ian's, where he had sensitivity and personal information, and develop acquisition functions which looked at, therefore, which piece of data would it be possible as the development in Bayesian optimization when they look at acquisition functions?
I haven't heard about a specific acquisition function for, I guess, for privacy data, but they're very general. I mean, you could essentially take any summary statistic of your underlying process or your underlying statistical model and use that as a term in the acquisition function to drive the search of new data. So I've seen even applications that, you know, are using the value of information in causal graphs to understand how interventions affect the outcome.
Yeah, so it just occurred to me that basically that it's a general framework for thinking about what other people are doing in the data security and usefulness space.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Sally. I think it would be really good to explore that avenue as well.
That's the next paper, Roman.
I have several on the pipeline, so let's leave that for next year.
Okay, so I think that's it for all of the questions. We would like to say thank you to all of our speakers for this session.
Thank you all very much for a really interesting and informative session. Thank you.